Hello, welcome to Pro Tips 40, where we're going to take a look at advanced reporting in Lansweeper Cloud. Now, many of you, like me, might be very familiar with how you do reporting in Lansweeper Classic, and you've been doing so potentially for quite some time. But now with Lansweeper Cloud coming up, we want to make sure that you can also create more advanced reports in Lansweeper Cloud, like I've been doing recently. So since I've been doing quite a lot of reporting in Cloud recently and getting the grips with what the report builder in Cloud has to offer, I thought I might as well share that information with everyone else so that you can also get more proficient in creating the reports, the same reports you might be creating in Classic, but then also doing it in Cloud, so that you can use that as well to create those same reports, those same advanced reports for all of your data. If you do have multiple installations, Cloud is very useful to kind of aggregate that information into one database. So you have one data set for all of your separate Lansweeper installations that you have. And the only way to really get reporting done on that, more advanced reporting done on that, is by knowing how you can do some of the more advanced things in the Cloud Report Builder. So let's head into Lansweeper and take a look at all of the things that will help you with creating more advanced reports. So I'm already here in the report section of Lansweeper. Now I'm going to start with a blank report just to give you a couple of hints there already, because even when you just start using the Cloud Report Builder, it's quite different from the on-prem one. This is maybe a bit more basic, but the Lansweeper Cloud Report Builder uses steps instead of just one set or one list of code, basically. And those steps can be quite useful. I'm going to come back to those later, because the first thing it will always ask you is to select fields. And then it already starts asking you what kind of, what collection would you like to start from. So you have to choose whether you want device and software information, Office 365 information, or user information. Let's go into the devices and software, because that's where most people will get their data from anyway. Now, when you get started with this, if you're not very familiar with the on-premise database and the fields there, it will already be kind of confusing. One good example here is if I just look for, let's say I'm quite new to Lansweeper and I want the domain information. Well, you quite quickly find out that, okay, I have about 30 or 40 domain fields here. For someone that's new to Lansweeper, that's quite difficult to find out, okay, which domain field should I select here? One good tip here is that below all of these fields, once you search for them, it will list what kind of collection they come from. These names are very similar to the on-premise data tables, basically. So this will already give you an indication of where that data is coming from. So that might help you with selecting the right field. Additionally, if you just want to, the safest option will most likely be if you select something from the root area. Now, maybe a bit confusing is that when you search for things, whatever is listed under root is basically the same as what's listed under the assets collection here. So if I were to remove this and just go to assets, all of this will be listed under root if you actually filter for something. Unfortunately, it is quite confusing at the moment, but that's just how it is. And for the domain specifically, that would be then asset domain. If I search here for domain again, there we go. Asset domain is already selected. I can also select user domain if I wanted to. But now it's actually filtering specifically within that asset. So I should actually click back on all results. And now you can see the same view as I had before. And that way you can apply it. Now, the second thing I want to touch on is the steps. So I'm actually going to quickly change some of the information because this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I'm going to leave domain, but also maybe just add asset name in there. Actually, the easier way for me to do it is just go to the assets collection, asset name, let's see, asset type name. That will be enough for this demo at least. Hit OK. There we go. So another thing is steps. So the builder works in steps. So we've completed our first step, which is selecting data. We can then add another step. Also, it shows a preview of what your current report would look like on the right-hand side, which is always useful. But my second tip would be really to take advantage of these steps. Specifically, I found these useful when applying a lot of filters. I found myself sometimes trying to add all of the filters I want to add in a single step, because I'm kind of used to that coming from the SQL reporting, just to add all of my conditions in one single area. But a lot of times it's easier both to create it and to understand what's happening in the report later on, or for someone else to use multiple steps to create these filters. Specifically when you have to like mix and or filters together. Actually, if I add another field here, something like software version and software name, it'll be the easiest way for me to actually showcase that. Because, and then also publisher, let's take that as well, publisher. All right, so let's say we want to have, as an example here, we want to have software name. We want to have something like contains, and then think of something, let's see, Office, that should have some results already. Office, there we go, and we want the asset type to be equal to Windows. Now at this point in time, we have a nice report basically of all of everything that is named, every software that is named actual Office and that is on our Windows machine. But let's say we want to add something else onto that, and I also want to see Windows software that is called Exchange. Now what I could do is add an additional filter to this, obviously. That's also software name. There we go, software name is contains, and then Exchange, and then I would again have to add the asset type, because as you can see in the preview, it has added Mac assets there, because apparently it found software with the word Exchange in it on Mac as well. So I'll have to add here, I'll have to add asset type name equal to Windows again. And if I want to do this for a couple of different softwares, I'd have to keep repeating the equal to Windows every single time because of this OR. Now, an easier way to do this is if we take advantage of those different steps, we can just add the two software names. And instead of trying to put it all in one single step, we can just add another step with an additional filter here where we just say, okay, now we have in the second step here, we just have filtered on all software that has the word Office in it, all software that has the word Exchange in it. And then in the next step, that's where we actually do our filtering on the specific asset type. So this is where we can say asset type equal to Windows, basically. And then we basically get the same list, but it's a bit easier to both understand and also to create, because you don't have to create as many filters in this one. So when you do this when these reports get more complex, it'll become easier if you just use more steps. It's a bit of a mind shift, different way of thinking, especially when you're used to coming from SQL. But once you get used to it and learn to use those steps more efficiently, it'll become a lot easier for you to create reports as well and to understand them for others as well. This is easier when you just come into it new to understand what's happening and what's going on there. So next up is where we're going to head into more some of the advanced things, or the advanced things, because up to now we've just used kind of the graphical editor. But when it comes to advanced reporting, most of the time you'll be working in kind of the code itself. So the basically MongoDB select or querying code. And you can always check the code of any step by hitting the check code button there. So I could switch all of these to kind of the code version of it. Obviously, if you're not planning to take anything from it or change it, you don't have to do this. But I find that sometimes it's useful just to take a look at what does the code look like. Just if you want to use it in another step, it can be useful. Now, let's say that I want to adjust any of these, then you can also always hit the edit button, and then you can just work in the code itself, which will be needed in some of the, or most of the more advanced reports that you'll be doing. But a lot of the times I don't start from scratch here, but I'll get back to that later as well. But you can edit any of these. It will give you kind of a, or it won't for me, but it will give you a warning, because I've dismissed the warning already, but it'll usually give you a warning of like, hey, once you start editing these, you won't be able to undo it. So be sure that when you start editing something in code, you're not planning to go back to the visual editor later on. So you can do anything with this code that you want at this point. But before we do that, I'm just going to close this because I want to touch on something else first. That is basically the one of the most important buttons in this whole area of reporting, which if I select, maybe I can just go to one of my, actually no, let's head into, not software, but I wanted to go to security, vulnerabilities, that's always a good one. Let's say there is a specific vulnerability that you've noticed, but we haven't created a report for yet. Or we might not be planning on it because it's a very niche one, something that's only applicable to your environment. Whatever the use case might be, there's a specific vulnerability and you want to create a report about it. I personally rarely start a report from scratch. To be honest, I cannot remember the last time I started or I used this create new report button, aside from just now, obviously. But I always start with an existing report, and I would recommend anyone else to do the same thing. Never try and start from a blank report. Always find a report that you can start as a template or they can use as a template. Let's just use this one BIOS firmware vulnerability. Duplicate button is right here at the top. You should always use it if you can. If it's a report that you think that might be similar to what you're trying to make, head over to it, hit the duplicate button. I always kind of just like add something else to the name so that I know that it's always there. And then I just hit the save button just to save it real quick so that I have my duplicate of the report saved. Right, so now that I've duplicated the report, change the name and given it and save it again, I can basically start trying things on it without worrying about breaking any of the other reports or messing anything up, basically. As you can see here, most of these kind of vulnerability reports or the more advanced reports, you already see that you won't see any graphical interface, maybe past step or past the first step. These are all created by either me or someone else within the company, all with custom code, basically. And that kind of brings us to one of the next steps or one of the next tools that you can really use to more easily understand what's going on, because a lot of times it's quite intimidating to read this code because it's not as friendly on the eyes as SQL code. But I've learned that it's actually not that difficult to understand, and there are some tools that can help you. I'm actually going to, let's see, select some of this code just as an example. Oh, it doesn't really matter how much I select. There we go, something like that. And one of the tools you'll probably also be familiar with if you've been keeping up with the news, ChatGTP, is actually quite useful for learning reporting for MongoDB. Not only to learn what is specific code doing, but also to get examples or even write some code as well. So I just selected some of the code that I had there, and then I'm just going to ask here on ChatGTP to explain to me what it actually does. So now that ChatGTP has finished, you can see it gives quite a decent explanation of exactly what this code does. If you just go to the summary, quite easily says that it searches documents in the database where the manufacturing field contains the string Lenovo and the model field contains either the string Flex 3 and then the specific model number, or the strings ID, pad 3 and another specific model number there. So we can basically understand that this is just a way for basically in the code to filter the results on both manufacturer, model, and a combination of those, basically. Now heading back to the code here, let's say we want to add something to this as well, then we can also use basically ChatGTP for that as well. Let's actually just head back to ChatGTP. If I wanted to, let's say, add an additional model to this, I could always ask ChatGTP to give me an example of that. Right, as you can see, it added the ThinkPad model, the ThinkPad X1 model now to the query. It even, like, I copied just at the top, if you can see here, like I didn't even copy the full code. It's actually, if I were to just copy paste this part that I pasted into ChatGTP, it wouldn't even work because it's not closed correctly. It's actually opening here again. And I wasn't actually aware of this, but ChatGTP even corrected it and completely closed it. So this, in theory, I could take this piece of code here and just insert it into my Lansweeper report, and it would just work straight away. There are obviously, ChatGTP is not perfect. There can be cases, and there's often cases where the code won't work immediately. The most frequent thing that I notice is, especially if you're not giving ChatGTP a example of code that it can start from, it won't add all the quotes because in Lansweeper, around all of the kind of variables and stuff, we add quotes, as you can see here. So everything like the and is in between quotes, the model is in between quotes, ThinkPad is in between quotes. There's a lot of quotes around. A lot of times if you just ask GTP about like how would I filter on a model in MongoDB, it will give you an example, but without the quotes around it. I guess that's a difference between how Lansweeper does its querying and how maybe traditional MongoDB querying is done. But you do have to take that into account to then add the quotes later on. So that's basically a quick demo of how you could use ChatGTP. It was quite an advanced demo, but you can do this a lot simpler as well with things like if you just want to filter on a specific version number and your version number needs to be greater or equal than. Basically any kind of question you have on MongoDB reporting, you could ask to ChatGTP and use his or use its kind of response to create your custom code in Lansweeper reporting as well. Now, next up, one thing that you might have noticed already here when I've been scrolling through this is it's not that easy to kind of work in this if you have a very long kind of series of code or a lot of models in this as I am scrolling through it. One thing that I often do when I have basically, most of the times really, because there's not a lot of room here, is I just go in, do a Control-A, Control-C, so select all, copy it, and then basically, there we go, Notepad++, open that, paste it in there, and now I actually have something that I can use full screen to actually work in. So actually a lot of times I do my coding and take my custom pieces that I get from ChatGTP and I put it in Notepad++. I kind of try and fix it, put it all correctly in there, and then copy paste it back into the Lansweeper code editor because it's just easier than trying to scroll to the right part here and adjusting it here, as well as one thing that I found useful, especially when you have these big kind of case statements or kind of filters, is that you can see exactly when things close. So I can see here that it opens with a bracket and it already indicates where it closes as well. Especially useful for when you have these big components here, as you can see. So I can easily scroll down and see that it'll probably close all the way at the bottom. There we go. And yeah, you can see exactly where it closes. It's useful for when you want to take pieces out and stuff as well. In the code. Now, the last thing I want to touch on is documentation. So there is documentation available that you can use to also learn about, what fields are available, what operations are available, those kind of things. They're all located here on the question mark. You can check the technical documentation. And one of the more interesting things here would be the filter operators. You can find exactly what kind of operators you can use. So when it comes to anything you might want to do if you want to create kind of an if-then statement kind of thing, which would be the switch. I was already looking at it. The conditional expression operators. Or if you want to, let's see if GTE is in here. It is. So if you want to find something that is greater or equal than, in this case it's a date, but you can also do that with numbers. There's all sorts of operators in here, as well as some examples as well that show you how to actually use it syntax-wise. Again, you can either look it up here in documentation. You could probably ask this to ChatGTP as well if you wanted to. So I'd really recommend just trying whatever works best for you. You can Google it as well if you want to go back to the kind of the classic way and just look it up on Stack Overflow. That's what I used to do, but I've kind of switched to ChatGTP now instead of using Stack Overflow. So that works quite well for me, at least. And aside from the cloud documentation, as I mentioned in the beginning, it's actually a lot of these names of these tables here are quite similar to the on-premise data fields. So I would actually also recommend to make sure that you have a bookmark or that you know where to find the on-premise database documentation as well, the Lansweeper Classic database documentation, because a lot of these fields are basically identical. So if you want to know what exactly that data is, where it's coming from, maybe even what data type it's in, although I don't know if those are really a one-to-one translation, but it will help you to understand what kind of data, where it's coming from, if you also have a link handy towards the on-premise database as well. I think I've gotten to pretty much the end of my time, because I could probably keep on going with this for quite some time. But I think these tips, at least these tips, will help you get started with creating those more advanced reports. I think especially if you want, the few things to take away from this really are that, one, use your duplicate button. Don't try and start fresh. I would always say try and find something. There's always a report you can start from, you can use as a template. And either use ChatGTP, Google, whatever you find the most useful to learn about what does a specific piece of code do and how can I adjust a specific piece of code to do what I want it to do. I've learned a lot of things through that, and just a lot of it is also just trial and error. And figuring out where you've probably misplaced a comma or something like that. That happens quite often as well. But yeah, it will take some time to get used to it. But once you've got it, once you've understood it a bit more, and with the tools that I've given you, you'll be able to pick it up a lot more quickly than you might imagine. At least I was able to learn it a lot quicker than I thought I would. So I would highly recommend you try these different tips and tools to start getting the grips with the Cloud Report Builder as well. And with that, I hope this has been useful for you and that you'll be able to use it well and that you can try it out a bit more as well. And I'll see you in the next Pro Tips.